Thank you all for coming. Rick asked me to come and relay some of the experiences we have had over the years. And RH2 Engineering is a full-service engineering design company. We're actually very similar to CH2M Hill, and in fact, our roots, so our founding principal in 1980 was actually a CH2M Hill employee who left to start RH2 Engineering. And in many businesses, we're direct competitors. So we're actually very similar. We're much, much smaller, and we are limited to the Washington, Oregon area. But largely what I'm going to talk about tonight is really a case study from Issaquah Highlands in the city of Issaquah. I have many examples in many cities, but this is, I think, a fairly good one that may be germane to what many of you in the room are thinking about and considering currently. And so I'm mostly going to describe some specific instances in the gestation of that project. There are many more, so there are examples from other cities. There are many more examples from Issaquah Highlands, but mostly this is going to be a case study. But before I start, I want to make sure that I at least get on the table that nothing I say tonight is intended to either imply or infer that I think municipal employees are inefficient or ineffective. They very often reside in a different functional structure that enables or disables various assets and liabilities that they have. My company has exactly those same assets and liabilities, but we are able to tap them and work around them in different ways because of the organizational structure. So nothing I should say should be interpreted as I don't think public employees or municipal staff are not as skilled or as motivated or as efficient as private staff, but because we work in different structures, we have different capabilities. Issaquah Highlands, I'm going to rewind now to the mid-1980s. Started as a large 5,000 plus acre tract of land that was purchased by Ken Behring, who owned the Seahawks at the time, and Black Hawk Development Company. It was in King County. It was zoned for 5-acre lots. Fast forward a couple of years, Ken Behring exits Seahawk ownership, exits development in the Northwest, sells that piece of property and the county's 5 units per acre development rights to Port Blakely Communities. And Port Blakely Communities, after having recently been exposed to the 4-to-1 set-aside program that was initiated by Gary Locke, by Governor Locke, looked at that opportunity for that piece of property, which was in the county at the time, but they went to King County and the city of Issaquah, who was adjacent to that piece of property, and said, we would like to implement a 4-to-1 exchange program here. We'd like to provide an urban village and set aside 4 acres for every acre we develop. In exchange for that, we'd like you to put your best foot forward on how you can help us develop it. King County didn't propose very much. The city of Issaquah really wanted to annex that project, partly because they realized that all the development that would occur there would drive through the city and therefore have city impacts, but would pay no city taxes. So they had a large incentive to actually annex that property. And they got pretty creative and pretty thoughtful about how they could incentivize Port Blakely Communities to appeal to annex to the city. And basically what they came up with was the organization I have worked for 22 years now, called the Major Development Review Team. And which, by the way, that organization won the Kennedy School of Business Innovation and Government Award in the late 1990s. But basically what the city offered to the developer is that we will provide contract engineering and planning services provided by a contractor and not by city staff. And that group would be a collaborative partner in building that development. So that partnership became unique of really the public-private collaborations that occurred up to that time, in that there was an overt recognition that the overriding goals of that organization were to be pro-project. So not necessarily pro-developer and not necessarily pro-city, but pro-project. And the city recognized that in order to make that effective, they would essentially need to step outside of the municipal organizational structure. And in this particular instance, particularly, they needed to step outside of a lot of community ill will who did not want that development to occur. So prior to this happening, city staff had been exposed to a very caustic community who didn't want this project to occur. It was a large tract of woods that were going to be cut down, and those are never particularly popular. And the feeling was the city staff had been tainted by or influenced by that, and they wanted essentially some fresh blood. So City of Issaquah was successful through all of that in annexing the property, writing a development agreement which would enable the major development review team. We applied for that project. Ironically, that was originally advertised in the Daily Journal of Commerce in 1996 as a building permit review task. They estimated it was 4 hours per week of work. We're still there 22 years later. We essentially function as the Public Works Department for that project. And our billings have been as much as $1.5 million per year to do that. So basically what we did is the city drew a boundary around Issaquah Highlands, and this is Issaquah Highlands in the map. And they made a geographic separation in their city, and they said everything outside of Issaquah Highlands will be handled by our existing Public Works Department. So permitting, planning, et cetera, everything outside the city is the conventional department. Everything inside Issaquah Highlands will be done by the Major Development Review Team. The Major Development Review Team will be staffed by a contract planner and a contract engineer, and I was the contract engineer in this regard, with one very unique and what turned out to be very enabling concept, and that was that group was allowed to deviate from existing city codes and standards. And they didn't have to justify, that deviation was better than the existing codes and standards. So most city codes and standards are written so that deviations are possible, oftentimes approved by and enabled by the Public Works Director, with the threshold for deviation being that the deviation has to be better than the existing code or standard. In this particular case, the City Council recognized, and I think very wisely so, that it's hard to define better in a narrow context, but easy possibly to define better in a broader context. So if you step outside of the classical role of engineering in this particular case, and you look at operation and maintenance, community safety, community assets, relationships to neighbors, et cetera, we could include those elements in the definition of when deviations from codes and standards would be better. That was a very unique situation at the time, very bold actually, of the Issaquah City Council, and it turned out to be a very important feature of what was to occur after that. The significance of that was we were routinely able to do things that the existing city staff couldn't do because we could reach across departments when they really didn't have the capability to do so. And we could reach across jurisdictional boundaries when they didn't really have the capability to do so. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. But anyway, on the screen is an aerial of Issaquah Highlands. For orientation, just to the left of the screen is downtown Issaquah, kind of left end. Up from the screen is Lake Sammamish. The bold line you see moving through there is I-90. This was 5,000 plus acres, 3,500 residential homes, 4 million square feet of commercial property. So it's fairly large development. It doubled the size of Issaquah at the time. Here's a picture of the commercial, and that picture was old, by the way. That was early in the development, not long after land clearing. Here's a picture, an aerial of the commercial area today. So that area developed with shops, theater. It's very popular. The development itself has proven to be very popular, and as evidenced by the time for homes on the market there and the appreciation of homes has outpaced the rest of the Puget Sound area routinely every year that it's been active. But one of the first examples I want to describe to you, and this was a situation that I think is best described by the deviation from codes and standards. One of the things that makes, this is my opinion now, one of the things that makes municipal employees unique from my employees is most municipal corporations are not built or have the capability to reward performance of individual staff, but they oftentimes monitor their staff and do staff evaluations based on errors, mistakes, and complaints. So what you wind up happening is a staff that, instead of being incentivized to innovate, is incentivized to not make an error. You know, if the community complains about something they've done, another department complains about something they've done, they haven't enforced a code correctly, that's what stands out in their day, not the innovations that maybe come about as their day. What that leads to is staff that very often rely heavily on codes and standards, treat them as gospel, and use that as their safety net in their own internal evaluations and obviously their career flows. In Issaquah, this was significant because Issaquah includes some lakebed sediment valley area and some high hill area. Road standards had been written in Issaquah, as they are in most cities, as a one-size-fits-all solution to any development project. So the road standards had been written very conservatively to deal with the weak subgrades available in the lakebed, in the valley area of the city, in the lakebed sediments. Issaquah Highlands is on a hill. In fact, most of it is on a old gravel quarry, where the subgrade is competent and very, very strong. One of the unique characteristics of the Issaquah road standards was they discourage developers from using the roads before they're finished. So the general construction plan, and this is common in many cities, is you prepare the subgrade and then you stay off of the subgrade until you're ready for paving. This was potentially a hardship to the developer in this case, because the road network that was being prepared that couldn't yet be paved, because paving then would be destroyed by subsequent development, blah, blah, blah. It really was a hardship to them. We enabled them, we not only enabled them, we encouraged them to drive on the prepared subgrades with heavy equipment. So they took large off-road trucks, they took earth-moving equipment, and we actually required that they drive on the prepared subgrades. What that did for us, it not only provided additional compaction, it gave us the ability to just periodically watch and look for pumping materials in areas that weren't stable and then replace those. Now, the significance of that is it saved the developer quite a bit of money. The significance to the city of Issaquah is this is now a picture of the major arterial that runs through this development 15 years after it was built. You can see that road is in nearly pristine condition. This picture is from a companion urban village, so a similar project. I won't name the city, but it's the same size project, the same kind of road, the same average daily traffic on this road. This road was built in accordance with conventional public works standards, where the developer was encouraged to stay off of the road before it was paved. And look at the cracking in the road. So we not only saved the developer a significant amount of money in this, but we delivered infrastructure to the city that was much more robust and has a lower operations and maintenance cost. My example of code compliance. Next example, contributions are working across departments. So most public works staff, take your typical public works staff, are really working confined to the boundaries of their department. Now, every mayor, every council, every administrator will encourage them to be aware of and be sympathetic to other departments' needs, whether that's a park department, the police department, the fire department, et cetera. But generally speaking, they're budgeted independently and separately. They're held accountable to performance targets independently and separately. They're really worried about their work product and not looking beyond. In the case of Issaquah Highlands, in the dedication of the Issaquah Highlands area to the city of Issaquah, the developer gave the city 47 acres of ground that was essentially unbuildable. So it was full of wetlands and it was relatively steep. It was always assumed through the planning of the project that this would simply be an open area and unused, because it had about 25% grade on it. It was really quite steep. The developer, completely separate topic now, they're going to come together in a minute. The developer, because they're developing such a large area, had a huge import of topsoil materials that they stripped from the lots. And they were paying about $12 a yard to take that material off-site and dispose of it, God knows where. So we had the idea, working with the park department, who we knew because we were also working with other departments in that city and other departments in other cities, and which city isn't short of park space. We knew that this 47 acres of ground was potentially great for a park, but it was currently unusable because it was too steep. But we had access to potentially 1.1 million cubic yards of topsoil strippings that the developer was currently paying $12 a cubic yard to haul off-site. So we essentially enabled the developer to dispose of their topsoil strippings on this piece of ground, and we, through some very innovative engineering, built some very steep walls, some very deep fills with this topsoil, which under most applications, so if you were complying with code in the city of Issaquah, you couldn't build a structural pad with topsoil. Well, we weren't building structural pads. There was no definition for anything else, but we, through, again, some clever geotechnical engineering, were able to fill 3 pads for ball fields and play areas in the park using the topsoil strippings. Some of these fills are 60 feet tall, 60 feet deep. So there's significant areas of fill, but it was essentially a disposal area for the contractor for free. And the way the contractor dealt with that is they built into their purchase and sale agreements that every individual builder had to use Port Blakely Communities to strip the topsoil, and they would do that at $8 a yard. So Port Blakely Communities made $8 a yard from the strippings. The contractor saved $4 a yard because normally that was a $12 per yard cost. Port Blakely Communities committed to the city that that $8 a yard that they made, they would dedicate $6 a yard of that to completing park facilities after all the fill was done. So today, there are 3 pads there with soccer fields, baseball fields, bathrooms, play areas, all paid for by the developer using savings from not having to export topsoil strippings because we could deviate from city codes and standards and provide significant fills and level those pads. So the park department had a need. We were able to leverage that need into economic benefit for the developer, and he was able to contribute a large part of that to city facilities. Example number 3, collaboration across jurisdictional boundaries. When Issaquah Highlands was conceived, the city of Issaquah was supplied fully by its own groundwater wells, all pumped from within the city limits. The expectation was that all development would be supplied by wells. Shortly after the development agreement was signed and after we'd built a couple of hundred homes, it became obvious that the city's aquifer wouldn't support the level of development that was intended for it. So there was a great scramble. What are we going to do? We're going to drill new wells. We're going to increase the supply capacity. Even if the aquifer would have supported the additional withdrawal, there was a significant permitting impediment to that, and therefore time impediment to get those wells approved. Water rights, as you may or may not know, in the state of Washington are very hard to obtain. We were aware, because of working with other clients on other jurisdictions, that the Cascade Water Alliance was looking for customers to enable construction of a regional pipeline from Bellevue to Sammamish Plateau. So instead of the developer taking the risk, the time risk of developing additional in-city groundwater supplies and the expense of that, we proposed that they actually build the regional pipeline that would connect the city of Bellevue and the Cascade Water Alliance system to city of Issaquah and the Sammamish Plateau. And furthermore, we suggested that they do that using 6320 bonding, public-private partnership. The developer was able to do it at higher cost than the well development would have been, but it was financed through the 6320 bond financing using municipal resources as the capital for that, which meant that the timing of it was secured. There was no uncertainty in the timing, but most importantly, that cost, which was about $37 million, came off of their books, which enabled them to finance other parts of the development. So the region, Bellevue, Issaquah, the Sammamish Plateau, got the regional water pipeline they were after The developer got the development surety they were after at the same cost. We were able to do that because we had affiliations with our other clients and other agencies, and we simply reached across those jurisdictional boundaries to enable that. Now, what's a little bit different about the MDRT in the city of Issaquah from what Matt was describing was in Matt's instances, generally they're assimilating a department for operations and maintenance purposes. Most of the work we've done have not been displacing staff. It's been providing staff in addition to staff that's already there. So whether it's like Issaquah Highlands where we're actually dealing in a different geographical area, or it's potentially just overflow permitting that your existing staff can't accommodate, most of our work is done side by side, shoulder to shoulder with existing staff. So we're not assimilating staff. We're not taking over departments. We're simply providing services that kind of dovetail into the existing systems. It can be equally effective, but it's actually quite a bit different situation. I wanted to show this because Rick seemed to be very interested in it at the time. This is not exactly the example Rick was talking about before, but these are 2 pages from a list of the permits that we processed in Issaquah in 2012. So this is from the year 2012. There are actually 9 pages of this. So in 2012, RH2 Engineering, operating within Issaquah Highlands on behalf of the Public Works Department, processed 405 permits. Now that, I think by any measure, is a pretty heavy permit load. That's more than 1 permit a day. And these are water line permits, sewer permits, road permits. These are heavy utility extensions and infrastructure. The city of Issaquah built their permit fee system to capitalize their public works department when they were working on permits. So by definition, I know you know it doesn't always work like this, but by definition, the value of the permit is approximately equal to the cost of the permit. Well, using the city's permit feeing system, these 405 permits would have generated $2.4 million in revenue. RH2 Engineering spent $800,000 processing those permits. So there's a factor of 3 to 1 there. In this particular instance, in this year, just on the cost of processing the permits. So when the question comes up, are contract services expensive? The intuitive number there, the low-hanging fruit that everybody grabs, is generally speaking, our fees appear to be 3 times higher than the equivalent city fee. So we're charging $150 an hour for a staff engineer 7. That same staff and engineer within a city is generally internally billing out at about $50 an hour. So there's this apparent 3 to 1 discrepancy there. First of all, that $50 per hour is not a true cost. And we saw this directly in Issaquah. Issaquah, in an internal city organization in about 2010 or about 2012, about this time, hired a contract agency to come in and help them with reorganization, and part of that was a cost of service analysis. And what they concluded was that the average public works employee, when you include their overhead, so when you include the cost, their share of the cost of the council, their share of the cost of the mayor, their share of the cost of the facilities, was exactly the same cost as our cost. This was about $150 an hour. So the true cost per employee, even if the city is billing them out at $50 an hour, is probably more in line with contracted services than is initially intuitive. But even that aside, I think you can see from this number here that contracted services can be that much more efficient. Now, how would I possibly explain a 3 to 1 ratio here, not just from billing rate, but in efficiency? How can my employees do 3 times as much as public works employees do? And the answer is really very easy, because on a contract basis, we don't have the disruptions that a public service employee has. Public service employees are dealing with counter calls, customers, internal meetings, their own strategic planning. There's a small percentage of their day that can be dedicated to doing the work that we all view as their output. Now, that's not to say you can get rid of all of that. You can't necessarily displace that. But that's the reason a contract service can be so competitive with public works services internalized, is because we, for lack of a better description, we don't have those distractions. We can come in, put our head down, do the work of engineering, and we don't have to worry about the customer counter calls and all of those other things. So both the combination of the true cost of services and the combination of the efficiencies we can bring because we're, by definition only, a contracted service, can very often make the contracted services much less expensive. Now, that doesn't mean it works all the time in all situations, but when the synergy is right, it can be a very effective combination. We save the MDRT in Issaquah, and I'm not personally taking responsibility for this because we had many other engineers involved, and there were also planning services involved, so only half of my work is what contributed to this. But the developer, Port Blakely Communities, had told us at one point that we saved them between $50 million and $100 million of cost by providing contracted services. And that was both in time and in direct services. Now, this is an $800 million, $850 million project, so that's a 10%, 15% savings, which, you know, is everybody's target, essentially, in that regard. I guess two parting thoughts before I go. The opportunities available for contracted services, I think, are really when you have a combination of things, but the real standouts for these are first when you want to displace risk. So this may be actual project risk. You don't want the risk associated with designing a reservoir. You want a consultant's insurance company to take that. But these can also be human resource risks. If you have a project that's controversial, and I'm just going to say this in a callous way, you'll know what I mean, and you need the ability to preserve, to throw somebody else under the bus because of it, a contracted service is a very effective way to do that. A consultant, a contractor, is very disposable in that regard. Your own staff, not necessarily so. And that can be a very valuable instance for a contracted service. Secondly, when you need to increase capacity. So you have a variable workload, it's hard for you to ramp up and down. Your human resource processes make it difficult to keep pace with the economic demands of growth. Contracted services can do that. Not only can I ramp up and down my employees faster than most municipalities can, but I can pull staff from other projects and ramp up and down much more easily. And the last of those is access to expertise. I have a department, I have a reservoir design department in RH2 Engineering, for example, and we have designed over 150 reservoirs. Most municipalities will design 1 or 2 reservoirs in the tenure of any professional's career. So it's unreasonable to expect staff who doesn't get the opportunity to do that very much to have the expertise to do that. Contracted services can provide that expertise. So if you want to displace risk, you want to be able to react to a variable workload, you want access to expertise, very often those contracted services can be very, very valuable and can, in the right circumstances, be significant cost savings. And that's about all I have, and I'd love to take some questions if you have them. Stan.
That terrace facility that you built. The terrace facility that you built, what was your ultimate grade that you were able to achieve with that?
It depended. We have some ball fields on some of them, and those grades, the grades we provided were dead flat. Now, they ultimately sloped the fields for drainage, but those were flat. On others that were just like big toy play fields, some tennis courts, et cetera, we left a 2% slope on those for drainage.
Okay. What about the slope itself, the terrace?
Oh, it was 1-to-1. Sorry.
1-to-1, great.
1-to-1. Yeah. Now, we actually had an option during design where we went 0.75 to 1, so it was actually a little steeper than 1-to-1. We didn't actually do that because we didn't need to. We had excess land, so we didn't need to make a hillside as steep as, but you can see from this, it's approximately a 45-degree slope, a 1-to-1 step.
Thank you.
I should mention, by the way, just because I think it's an interesting anecdotal story, the clever engineering I referred to on how we could make a topsoil fill that was that thick was that all the material had to be uniformly crummy. So the problem is with topsoil is you have a lot of settlement as the organics decompose. If you have an uneven bottom topography, or you have areas of good soil mixed with bad soil, you wind up with a lot of differential settlement at the top. But as long as all the fill in there is terrible, it all decomposes and sinks at the same rate. So you don't notice that happening, as long as you don't put a structure on it, and we didn't put anything bigger than a bathroom facility. There's actually an asset in just making it uniformly awful.
Are you still working with Issaquah?
We are. So we have now been there 22 years. Issaquah maintains a public works department, which they call Public Works Engineering, and there are about 7 or 8 staff there now, and they maintain, our group is now called, no longer called MDRT, it's called DSD, Development Services Department, and we're a contract services agency that does some projects in the city. Public Works does some projects. Rick had mentioned the value of competition. We essentially compete with Public Works and vice versa for projects. And they have made us more efficient, and we have made them more efficient. Both services have benefited from that relationship.
So Dan, I'd like to ask you a question. I mentioned to you the fact that the CTAC has a relationship with the Port of Seattle. If we have a contract called the ILA, Interlocal Agreement, and one of the things in the past that has always been negotiated away by the port is they want to do their own permitting. Personally, I would like to see the city retain its permitting over the port. I think it gives us a lot more control. But there are folks that object to it because they think, well, you couldn't bring a permitting operation on quickly enough. If the contract's not approved, it expires in February, is it 19th? February? Mid-February next year, and the decision whether or not to go ahead is in January, then we would have to ramp up quickly. Do you have any thoughts on how quickly it could actually happen for something like that, like you said, working shoulder to shoulder with an existing permitting staff? And any thoughts on potential efficiencies in having a broader vision than just the Port of Seattle?
Sure.
Thank you.
So knowing very little other than what you just told me, and I'm speaking now in the absence of what are the standards, what are the regulations, are they done, are they mature, have they been tested, what are the opportunities for synergy with agencies outside the airport, et cetera, et cetera. We were able, in Issaquah Highland Spring, I'll just use that as an example, we were able to permit as much as $100 million a year of infrastructure with a staff of 3. So assuming the port didn't have more than $100 million a year of development they were proposing, it's as easy to me as bringing 3 staff members in for permitting, and I have 3 staff members that I could tap on the shoulder tomorrow morning and say, you're now going to work on these projects. So literally bringing the resources to be able to begin permitting operations is limited really only by how long does it take those staff to become familiar with the regulations they're working under to begin effective plan review. And that's usually not more than a couple of days, whether you're reading codes, standards, or whatever. The real potential advantages, though, to the port in potentially contracted services is the ability to reach across jurisdictional lines and look for synergy outside of the port itself, in the city of SeaTac, the city of Burien, wherever that may be, whether those are road infrastructure projects, utility infrastructure projects, community assets and amenities. My experience has been, even when none of those are immediately obvious, there are always opportunities to align interests for the common good of a larger group than it is for a smaller group. So those opportunities have always been available in my experience and through my career. The more broadly you cast the net, the more opportunities there are for cost savings and benefits for all parties.
So would you say that, would you say that part of that 100 million savings in the case of the Issaquah Highlands was because of that broader scope you're talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I have to be delicate. Let's say that the party that you are providing the services towards, the one seeking the permits, not the city, is tied up in federal regulations, is tied up in the belief that they are an autonomous organization that need not bend to anybody. Does that change the equation at all for you?
I'll be delicate too. No. And the reason being, I can't think of any autonomous organization bound by federal regulations where their entire business plan or set of objectives and improvements are strictly bound by those federal regulations. There are always opportunities outside of regulations and outside of federal regulations to provide benefits that may not classically be in their jurisdiction. And I can't be very specific because I don't know a lot of the specifics, but we have certainly been involved in many situations where a project was tightly constrained by either a state or a federal regulation. And those most often, in my career, have really been environmental regulations. They haven't been safety regulations or security regulations or things like the port, for example, may find. But there are always pieces of infrastructure, pieces of opportunity and objectives that are not bound by those regulations that can make those projects better or easier or faster or less expensive. I have never met a project that was so well-defined or tightly constrained that there were no opportunities for improvement if you were just creative or innovative. One may exist, and I'll be proved wrong. I haven't found one yet.
The problem facing the port, in my opinion, is it's the 5 pounds of peanuts in a 3-pound bag.
Sure.
And that they've been stalled for about a year now. They haven't brought out another plan. They started putting one together and they had meetings and they just stopped. And I have a feeling that there will be conflict down the road. So I don't know what to expect from them. I mean, they're tough to read.
Sure.
But I appreciate your input, and it's good to know that I'm interested in how you would assess the actual number, because I do believe the dollar amount of the building is significantly larger over the term. So, significantly.
And having just said what I did, I don't want to give anybody the impression that I actually know how to answer that question, or that the same opportunities that existed in the city of Issaquah that I just described could in any way be transported here. I'm going to guess an airport is a much tougher regulatory situation than a city park. But I would still hold that I'm not sure, because there isn't the appearance of synergy or opportunity or innovation, that it doesn't exist.